Well, welcome everybody to this event. This is the launch of Angie's book, Activism for Life. I'm Paul Rogers. I'm joining you from Kirkburton in West Yorkshire. Angie is with us from her home in Knighton in Powys. And we have Lauren from Luath Press, who is looking after the technical side in Edinburgh. So in a way, this is actually a three-country presentation, if you will. It's a real delight to be here. I've known Angie for over 30 years. And it's been remarkable to see what she's done, the extraordinary things she's achieved. I'll start actually by quoting from Caroline Lucas, and this is what she said about Angie's book, in fact about Angie. It's been one of the privileges of my life to be with Angie as she stands up for justice, peace, and the environment. She personifies what being an activist means: courage, commitment, and a conscience. She's an inspiration for us all. And I would heartily endorse all those words. Angie, we have about 45 minutes for discussion, and then there'll be time for a few questions. And there's much to discuss. I think we'd really need 2 or 3 hours to do justice to what I think is a remarkable book and certainly deserves to be a bestseller. I'd like to start, if I may, by when I think we first met. And that was about 30 years ago, when you took a few courses in Bradford at the Peace Studies Department, joining part of the MA program. And I remember the first time we met, so it was a seminar, and you were sitting at the front and I was holding forth a bit, and I could see that you weren't entirely agreeing with what I was saying. And that, I think, is absolutely typical, if I may say, because you will question anything, particularly from authority. And although I was not authority, I was somebody to be questioned. What you did say in your book, in fact, what it says in the book, and my reason for mentioning this, is that when you came to Bradford, you were already involved in activism pretty thoroughly, and you'd followed work on nonviolence, so the inspiration from Martin Luther King and from Gandhi. But what you found at Bradford was all the other work, people like Gene Sharp and the many other people who'd worked on nonviolent direct action over the years. And that seemed to be sort of something which at least gelled a bit. But can you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in this, and particularly your early experience in Cameroon, which I sense was very influential to you. But let you start at the beginning and tell us how you got into this in the first place.
Well, when I was at school, I heard people talking about voluntary service overseas. And so I was extremely interested in development issues and thinking I could go somewhere and help. And when I was 21, I just got married and went to Cameroon. And I suppose it was there that I suddenly realized that racism existed. I found out about colonialism. I met some extraordinary, wonderful people, Cameroonians. One man, Peter, became a very great friend of us. He was a local person working at the banana plantations, illiterate, but absolutely amazing. And he introduced us to a lot of the villages around there and became a very close friend. All the expatriates there were African expatriates as well from other English-speaking African countries, and a lot of white expatriates. They all had servants. And they said, why aren't you getting a servant? You know, you've got these servant quarters at the back. Why aren't you doing it? I said, somebody can have that for free. In fact, we gave it to Peter's younger brother. We just didn't want to have servants because we just felt that divide between, especially white people, but expatriates and the local community would not help us to make friends and be all right. And it was just an extraordinary experience, experiencing that racism, which I hadn't come across before. And I think I explained in the book, I had this party, you know, when whites were at one end, blacks at the other end, women one end, men the other end. And after all of our local friends left, there were these white expatriates from Britain and the USA making horrible comments, racist comments. And it was just extraordinarily horrible. I don't know if you had a similar experience to that.
I did. My first post was actually, it was in a government post in Uganda. I worked partly in Kenya, partly in Uganda, mostly in the latter. And it was basically an agricultural research project. And I was based at the National Agricultural Station, just a few miles outside of Kampala. And there was a pretty similar experience. In some ways, it was quite a small station. The white people there were probably only about a dozen in number. One or two of the men absolutely loved the country and were sort of really immersed in it. And because Uganda was really pretty developed in the late 60s with a very strong sort of culture of its own, particularly around Kampala, you could not say they were racist. But quite a few of the others basically were only there because they were perhaps alcoholic, or one way or another, they could not get jobs back in Britain. And they and some of their families were really heavily racist. It was a real learning experience for me. Now, this was at the end of the 1960s, earlier than you, but it's the same sort of experience. And it stayed with me. I learned a huge amount there. I contributed very little in my job, but I learned a heck of a lot there. But you came back. I mean, that was a major experience for you, and you worked a lot in tropical countries. So we'll come on to Sarawak a little later on. But you came back to Britain, and from then, quite quickly, you got involved in campaigning and indeed direct action. And one of the early instances, if I remember in the book, was your experience with what was called the Snowball project. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And if you do so, could you also mention that lovely area where you actually, I think you sold off almost all your possessions so the bailiffs wouldn't get them if they were out to sort of get your say a little bit about that. It's lovely.
Okay, well, I mean, my first experience coming back from Cameroon was the World Disarmament Campaign petition, and then I got involved in the peace movement and the local Chroma peace movement when I lived in North Norfolk. And then with a group of women, I went to Greenham, and on the fence of Greenham, it said, "Carry Greenham home." And we have no leaders, the stars are in the sky. But the Carry Greenham home, I had small children, they were about 6 and 8 at the time. I couldn't spend that much time at Greenham, the 2 or 3 days at a time with my parents-in-law and my husband, able to look after the children when I was there. So I then started the Snowball campaign, which was cutting one strand of fence. So that it was criminal damage, but it was very minimal. It was symbolic, like a lot of nonviolent actions were. And at that time, people thought that was terrible, you know, property destruction, absolutely awful. And there were a lot of debates at that time about what's right, what's nonviolent. Is it violent or nonviolent to destroy property? And there was this incredible debate with local politicians, and different people came and took part in that, and a lot of local people did. And our local court at Fakenham, where we did these actions at a US base, was full of local people coming along and talking about why it was so important to stop these nuclear weapons from being based in all these US bases around the country at the time. We had a lot of fines to pay. And you referred to this one incident when I had a large fine to pay and decided that I would auction all the property in my house. And so a local person came along, and he was the auctioneer, and he set up in the kitchen at home. Everyone went round the house, and they came back and they bid, you know, 50p for the car, 10p for the fridge. My poor son's snake went for 10p or something. When he came back from school and he heard this snake had been sold, he was really upset until he realized that actually nothing was going to go. All the people that had signed a little document, they'd given the money over, which went to the Snowball campaign, and they said, this property must remain in the house until we come to collect it, but it's ours. And then I took all of those receipts to the local police station and showed them to them, and the police officer had already knew about some of the things that I'd been doing, and he just laughed, and that was the end of it. Actually, we never had to pay those fines, because we'd also said that if they did come and get it, those people would sue the bailiff for taking their property. If they did it, we would do something called everlasting bidding, which I'd heard from in America. Some people have been doing it. You go along to the auction and you make sure you have enough people there, and you keep bidding and bidding, and it goes up to millions and millions of pounds. Eventually the auctioneer stops the auction because it's just going to go on, and that's the end of the auction.
Yes, but one could imagine that somebody like Gandhi would have loved that if it had been possible in his time. Yes.
Yes.
Just as I want to come back to this, Angie, just as a brief aside, just on a personal thing. You mentioned Green and Common. On our small holding here, I have about 30 meters of the original Green and Common fence. which was
Wow.
actually taken down legitimately, and was available, I think, to 2 local Quakers. And how it came here is neither here nor there. But I look at that almost every day and think, yes, that is symbolic, and it may be the only bit left. But just to come back to Snowball, because there's another side to it that you mentioned in your book, a very interesting one. And this is one of your early learning experiences about direct action, because what you plan to do, if I remember rightly, correct me if I'm wrong, you were going to start with 3 people, and then I think treble it, and then treble it again until you got more and more people taking part.
Yes.
But you learned a lesson from that, did you? Could you explain that a bit?
Yeah, whatever your idea is, it's gonna change, and that was impossible, really. It can't just treble, you know. And the local police were having a betting thing. How long will it go on to? It went to 3, 9, 27, and then 90 something. But we'd kind of, by the 4th stage, it had kind of lost its trebling capacity. And I just learned from that, yeah, you make mistakes, but sometimes, you know, coming up with an idea that's maybe impossible for some people's ideas, it is at least sparks people's enthusiasm and they want to get involved. And in fact, later on, we did that with the Faslane 365 year, a whole year of blockades. When people said, you're never going to get a whole year covered, you're not going to get all these people to turn up. And of course, we didn't get every day covered, but we got most of them covered. We didn't get 100 people a day, but we got enough. So what I learned from that is, yeah, you make mistakes, you learn from them, but kind of don't give up. And there's something probably in the idea that might help you proceed, if you like.
Yes. I've just seen that Sarah Buxton has just put in chat that she also got a section of green and common fence, but that was taken rather than legit, which good for you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I actually got a lot of my early fence cutting experience there. You know, how you cut as fast as you can and then get in, because we were in and out of that base the whole time.
You've got to have a really good bit of bolt cutters to do it well, haven't you? It's a tough fence, I must admit.
Yeah.
Actually, staying with well, linking a little bit with that was another thing which came basically from your early concerns with protecting the rainforests, and that related to I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you actually took some mahogany, I think, to the local police station to say that this was actually a theft because it had been taken illegitimately, breaking a particular. Can you just explain that? Because I know I haven't got the full story, but it's another very worthwhile way of actually going things laterally to great effect. So just tell us a bit about that.
Well, I can't remember whether it was before or after I went to Sarawak, but I think it was after I came back from Sarawak. But first of all, my interest in forests occurred when I was in Cameroon, and I just saw these incredible trees. When I first went to Cameroon, I almost didn't understand how big they were. And I came back to Britain in the middle of the 3 years, saw our tiny trees, and suddenly the contrast between the huge trees out in the forest there and the trees that we had back here was just paramount, you know. And then when I went to Sarawak, which we'll come on to later on. Where were we talking about? It was... Yes, why the ethical shoplifting.
Yes, that's it. Yeah,
I discovered that a lot of there was a huge campaign being by lots of different organisations, Greenpeace, WWF, FOE, because of the loss of rainforests all around the world, the Brazilian forests and everything. And we actually joined the Tiger Rescue Network about the boreal forests as well. And I was staggered to find how little forest, real ancient forest we had left here. In fact, we've got none left pretty much. And it was really important to understand that we were importing all this wood from these countries, and most of the timber merchants had absolutely no idea where it was coming from. They didn't even know the difference between the different timbers very often. And so we needed to talk about this and arrange it. And I'd already met a really great lawyer with Bindlands at the time, and I asked him to write a letter to the timber importers saying that this wood was stolen from indigenous reserves, and so it was stolen property, and would they stop it, would they do anything about it? Of course, got no response. So we decided that we would do something called what I called ethical shoplifting. We would go into a shop, and we started this in Norwich at Bonds, went in and got a plank of mahogany, took it to Norwich police station, said, this is stolen property and we'd like to report this crime. And then we were arrested for stealing, strip searched, treated quite badly, and then released. And I then went round and got there was a local film cameraman. He came in with us. We went back into the police station and said, we came in to report a crime of stolen property, and all you did was arrest us. What are you going to do? We didn't even get a crime number. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry, because we had the cameras there, gave us a crime number. We went, nothing happened. So we expanded that, and I started something called the Citizens Recovery of Indigenous Peoples Stolen Property Organisation, CRISPO. And we used the Norfolk Constabulary label and put CRISPO Officer number 1, and we organised a massive shoplift of bonds, and we all went in, took a piece out, took them to the police station. At the same time as we were going in, we had somebody go in with our officer numbers, who we were, and that we were going to take this timber, these timber things like mahogany seats and mahogany clocks and things that we knew were stolen, or the wood was from stolen Indigenous reserves, and that it would be taken. So we couldn't be accused of theft or shoplifting, and we called it ethical shoplifting. Brilliant. And that was fascinating, and it really set up a buzz in the timber trade industry, which we then started talking as directly as we could with the directors of the timber importers. And after quite a long period of time, they actually changed their practices, and now most timber importers know where their wood is coming from, even if it's still not very sustainable.
Well, that is at least a start. I mean, I wanted to mention that, Angie, because one of the extraordinary things about this book is all the different experiences which you fit into it. And also towards the end, the way you explore how it all fits together, the different approaches you can make, and the pitfalls as well as the successes. It really is quite remarkable. Can we talk, I've got to watch the time because we're getting on to halfway already and there's so much to talk about. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your experience in Sarawak? I'm afraid it will have to be fairly quick, because there's so much on the British side as well. But tell us more about that.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I mean, I'd never been to a place like that before. We hadn't met. It was the first international Earth First kind of direct action. There were 8 of us from 6 different countries. We met in the Near Caves, and we did an action to try and stop the timber being exported to Europe, basically. We were arrested, and then we had this amazing court case where we were able to raise the issues of the corruption of the chief minister, who was getting all the profits from this, and raise all the issues about how the indigenous people, the Panan there, were being deprived of their forest. Yeah, I mean, it was...
You spent some time in prison there as well, didn't you? And I remember you actually wrote a letter to one of the local papers, because quite a lot of people in that part of Malaysia were claiming that, in a sense, you were damaging their security by these kinds of actions. And did that letter actually get published? Because you got it in the book, and it's a beautifully constructed letter.
Part of it did, but not much of it. But we got it out in various different ways. I mean, we were told eco-imperialists, and they thought that we were some kind of crack unit come to destroy, create world war against Sarawak. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I put that in its entirety in the appendices of the book, because I think it is quite interesting, and it describes the issues that are there.
I should actually say at this stage that, I mean, the book is basically almost an autobiography of all the things that you've been involved in, but you have a series of appendices, many of which are really interesting in their own right. It's not sort of at the end of a book. I mean, and this is one of the really good ones, but many of them, I mean, the appendices add so much more to the book, which is one of the lovely things about it. I said at the start of the conversation that we first met when you came to Bradford over 30 years ago to do some studies. I think that the last time you and I met was actually about 3 years ago. And Claire and I had gone down to one of the big climate change demonstrations in London. And at the end of the day, we happened to end up in a cafe, I think, fairly near Victoria Station. And that's where you were as well. And it was lovely to see that. But in a way, that's the fascinating thing is I think that the times we've met in between have mostly been in court, usually on nuclear issues.
You've been a very, very important expert witness in the Hawk action case.
Yes, pretty peripheral, but I mean, fascinating from my point of view. But it gives me the chance to talk at the end about all you've been doing recently, particularly with Extinction Rebellion. But I would like to look at that long period involving the nuclear weapons and particularly the court cases. I mean, I think I was involved in only 3 or 4 of them, but 2 of them were the really significant ones. As I say, my role was peripheral, but what actually happened was extraordinary. Could we start off by looking at Hawk Plowshares, where you were part of a group of about 10 people, 4 women of whom were actually involved in this direct action, a quite remarkable one. And many people know what happened, but some may not. So the end result was quite extraordinary. So tell us about Hawk Plowshares and that event.
Right, well, the 10 women took a year to plan this, and we got a video of using some of John Pilger's film of the genocide going on in East Timor and the background to these horrendous arms sales by British Aerospace. And they're still doing horrendous arms sales to Saudi Arabia that are bombing Yemen. So we've still got a huge amount to do to try and stop this arms industry. And after preparing for a year and meeting with the executives of BAE and trying to stop the export of Hawk jets to Suharto in Indonesia, who was committing genocide in East Timor, in February, we 3 people went in and did a lot of damage to one of the planes. And I believe it was you that gave us the link to a Spain plane spotter that gave us the exact number, so that when we went into Wharton, or when the 3 women went into Wharton, they were able to just destroy that aeroplane that was going out to Indonesia. £1.5 million worth of damage was done, and we spent 6 months in prison, but we won the court case. And this was with a judge that had said when I was in court before him, when I was on my own and there was nobody there, women like you should be locked up for a very long time. And when I said to him, I hope you're not going to be our trial judge because you've already shown how biased you are. And he said, yes, I am. and he was. And we found out later that he was called Wackham Wickham. He was so awful. But he did us a favor, because when the East Timorese leader came along, Jose Ramos Horta, as an expert witness, and we were asking him in court to explain the genocide of whole tribes of people in East Timor, the judge pretty much tried to close him down and say, answer yes or no. And I stood up in court when he had to go, and I said, I'm really sorry about the way the judge has treated you, which when you're representing yourself, you can say, but of course yes, a lawyer is not allowed to say that. He was so outrageous, saying things like, well, if we weren't selling weapons, the French would sell them to them, that the jury found us not guilty. And it was a really, really important court case.
It was extraordinary. I mean, yes, I remember I was just involved towards the end trying to say what the planes would be going on to do. And in fact, the same plane spotter, I won't mention his name here, but he actually pointed me the day before I was due to give evidence to an article in one of the leading aviation journals, Aviation News, which actually specifically said where those planes were going to. And it was actually to a counterinsurgency squadron. And I didn't know where that was located, but on the way into the Crown Court, I called in at W.H. Smith's and found out where the place was, and it was within combat radius of East Timor. And we could say that in court, and the judge was pretty furious, in fact, that they got out. I must say, Angie, I mean, I've been involved in quite a lot of expert witness over the years. Never before had I been involved where you actually had a judge so biased. And in fact, even when you're cross-examined on things like British nuclear policy, it is very like cross-examining, because they don't want to give you a chance to say too much about what the targeting would be like. So in fact, that and recently being involved in the Julian Assange case are the only places where I felt under pressure in the witness stand. And it's quite remarkable that I think that the jury recognized what was really going on. And you did such an incredible case, and you brought the people in from there. I gather that the judge immediately put on some sort of injunction to stop you taking any more action against the British Aerospace. Is that true?
When we came out, within an hour, British Aerospace had come along and put civil injunctions on us, and a whole list of all the places that BAE have around Britain to say that we couldn't go there. And actually, we couldn't afford not to sign for it. We asked lawyers and things. So we did sign it, which would have meant if we'd done anything else at those listed places, we would have been imprisoned immediately. Yes. But of course, there are lots of other things to do. You know, if as an activist, if you're stopped from doing one thing, you know, the corporate abuses going on, you can always find something else to protest about.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Where these cases go through to a jury, you can't predict the results. I mean, there was Clive Ponting, who was found not guilty at the Old Bailey. There was Michael Randall, who you know, and Pat Pottle, who'd actually broken out George Blake. And they were released on the basis of what they said they were doing. And it does happen on occasion.
Yeah. The scary thing is, though, is that it's changing a bit now, and we're going more to the American system where they're trying to stop you giving evidence, or certain evidence is not in front of the jury, or sometimes not in front of your lawyer either. So we have to be really careful. A lot of the things that we've relied on in the British judicial system is being stopped, like legal aid, for instance. You know, so when I went to become an expert witness in a US Ploughshares case, I was astounded at how little the defendants were allowed to say, how they couldn't give the evidence that we were giving in our cases here. And then when they were found guilty, they got much, much longer sentences. You know, it's quite astounding that we use the US as a kind of, we want to be more like the US, when so much is wrong over there, and we've got so many other examples that we could use if we wanted to in Europe as better systems.
Yes, and I mean, we're hugely dependent on those relatively few lawyers who will work on this one. I mean, Bindman's as a group is quite astonishing, or Bindman's Pierce as it is now. And Gareth Pierce, I mean.
Gareth Pierce is an amazing.
Amazing, yes, she really is.
She's a lovely woman.
And she's been hugely involved in the Assange case. I won't say more about that because that's still under appeal. But essentially that is very much ongoing now. But there was another case, I mean, of the many you've been involved with, I think several hundred times you've been arrested. There was another one, which of course was the Trident Plowshares, which ended up at the Greenock Shearers Court. Can you say a little bit about the background to that, and particularly the case itself? Because the result there wasn't quite the same, and it was very significant that it wasn't. So tell us a bit about Trident.
That was when three women again, from Trident Plowshares, and we destroyed all the equipment that was making the submarines invisible under the water. So we did, again, a lot of damage, and we're in prison for 5 months. But then again, we won that case, but that was very interesting because the judge was completely different. She was a fair, impartial judge. She listened to the evidence, and she decided that we did have a case in international law, that if you took all the information about what Trident could do, what these nuclear weapons could do, then we had a right to try to prevent these international laws from being broken. That was considered, it couldn't be appealed because we were found not guilty, but they took some legal points of it from that case, took it up to the Lord Advocate's reference, which is the highest court of appeal in Scotland, and over four or 5 days that was argued. We had 3 judges, 3 High Court judges, including Judge Prosser, and I, after quite a lot of campaigning, managed to represent myself at that case, which was great. So it could be in ordinary language, and so I could understand what was going on. They didn't like that. They would have liked a lawyer to have argued on my case, but I couldn't trust that process. I needed to say what I needed to say. The Judge Prosser, said that I asked him, would he definitely promise to look at what Trident was capable of doing and the international laws, because I knew if they could put those two together, they could prove without doubt that it was unlawful. And he said yes, and in fact he didn't.
Yeah.
And they even said that Britain wasn't even at war. I mean, we haven't been out of war for decades.
No.
Oh.
I mean, I think, you know, the Trident is so significant. I mean, it's a classic. It's a delusion of post-imperial grandeur for Britain, and it's just like the French quotes deterrent as well. I mean, it's a nonsense from start to finish, and I think it has been right from the start. And the reality is, depending on how you use these things, you could take a single Trident missile submarine, and you could probably kill 20 million people in about an hour and a half. Certainly, at least, sort of set the radioactivity and the rest up. I mean, it's an abomination, and you just wonder why we still persist with this. Of course, many countries haven't, and we do have the Nuclear Weapons Convention, which is remarkable. And here again, but that again, it brings in the legal dimension. But I don't want to stay with this, Angie. There's so much more else. Really, you've been involved in many other of these actions. Can we stay just, before we go on to the environment side, can we stay a little bit longer with all the more military side and the other things, and what sort of experiences, looking back on it, are there things which you might do differently now, or has it all been part of a very broad learning experience?
It's all been a broad learning experience, and it depends, you know, some of these things have been, I've been invited to do. It's like going to Sarawak. Well, I was invited by some young Earth Firsters to go, you know. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what I would have done differently. I think if I'd had just more information earlier on, if I'd been better educated, if my university education, you know, had been a little bit broader. I mean, the reason I went to Bradford to do peace studies is I realized I didn't know enough about any of these things. But then you never know enough. And actually, we don't need to know more than just to be a human being and compassionate. If something looks wrong and you can see a human rights abuse in front of you, it is wrong and we should stop it. So sometimes we can become unable to do anything because we think we don't have enough information. And there's always more information and we never have enough, but you can tell as a human being what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah. And as long as there are a few people around who dig into the detail and come forth if need be, it's not necessary. And I think the other thing is, you know, whatever people are doing as individuals, they have to fall back on the remembrance they're part of something much bigger.
We're all part of a movement and we all rely on so many other people, absolutely.
Very much so.
Yeah.
You've worked in a number of different countries and you've actually been in prison in a number of countries. Where else have you worked outside of Europe, for example, which have given you other experiences?
Canada and Poland. Poland's trying to save the Białowieża forest. That was amazing. I'm camping outside the environment ministry there, and Polish people love their old forests, and they just needed a little bit more of a kind of international solidarity to try and stop the loggers from doing stuff, you know. Israel, was that in Europe or out of Europe?
Well, yes, that says a great deal politically, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically part of NATO almost, you know, I mean, it's like horrendous. My experiences there have been absolutely horrendous, actually. Yeah, man's inhumanity to man. That's what you see there all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. You've been very much involved in recent years in different aspects of campaigning on the broad environmental issues. Does your interest in this go right back to the start, or was it part of what you became clear to you when you were involved in movements in Sarawak and the whole reforest movement? Where did that stem from?
Maybe when I first went to Norfolk and got involved in the Soil Association, Henry Doubleday Research Association. But you know, any issue that you think about and get involved in, if you dig deep enough, you come to the same place, which is basically the corporate structures that are destroying our planet. You know, so and ever since Greenham, when we were discussing around the campfires, how everything is basically linked. After a while, you can't really say there's this issue and that issue. They're all linked in some way or another.
But you got on to campaigning on climate change really quite some time ago. And that's occupied a lot of your time in recent years. And most recently, you've been involved in Extinction Rebellion. Can you say a little bit about what your involvements have been, and to what extent has all your previous knowledge and experience, both in places like Sarawak and all the work on nuclear and military issues, how does that sort of compare, and how does it in a way illuminate what you've been doing on the environmental side more recently?
Well, the climate change stuff, I suppose, I became aware of that when I was in North Norfolk in Norwich. There was the greenhouse at Norwich, lots of things happened there. And this is the links, everything being linked up. One of the expert witnesses we used in the early Snowball cases, Nick Kelly, was in at the UEA, University of East Anglia, in the climate department. And so he was talking about the nuclear winter there, okay? And at the greenhouse at the time, we were also talking about climate change and how much of Norfolk would be underwater and how much of London. We had maps up, you know, and this was in the 80s. So I was involved in climate change discussions very early on, and what you could do, change your light bulbs and don't have plastic and don't do this, all the things we're talking about now. And I was very concerned that, yes, we've all got to make these individual changes, but unless the structural changes occur, nothing is going to happen on a big enough scale to stop climate change. And then when I heard about Extinction Rebellion happening, in April of 2019, I just went along and joined in, and then was invited to start XR Peace, which we did, and we got joined in the October 2019 rebellions. And then again, putting together some of the information that was out there for my trials helped clarify where we've got to. And of course, it was as we'd said decades before, you know. And I don't know whether we're going to do anything, because the governments and corporations are just greenwashing everything and saying they're doing stuff. The biofuel stuff, for instance, takes you back to the destruction of the forests. You know, we can't be importing wood chips that are destroying forests somewhere else and then calling that a green solution. A lot of these green solutions that corporations are coming up with are the worst things possible.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, there is so much greenwash around on it. But in a way, I mean, I suppose with the whole, we shouldn't use the term climate change. It's climate breakdown or climate chaos.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to say that The Guardian is now starting to use climate breakdown for the first time, which I think is a marker. Then it's certainly true that we're 20 years late. But on the other hand, it is still possible to make the changes, and I think we have to keep the optimism going. But we've got about just 5 minutes or so before we go on to questions, because we have some questions coming in. But I really wanted to ask you sort of more broadly, where do you see the major issues? What are the changes and the developments? You just mentioned the corporations. What are the changes and developments which you think we need to be more aware of? You mentioned the contrast between American and British judicial systems, but more widely than that, where do you think that we need to be more on watch than maybe we've been in recent years?
Whoa, that's a difficult question, that one. Well, for a start, we've got to change our whole democratic system. You know, going smugly around the world saying we've got democracy here. We haven't got democracy. Voting every 4 years. Maybe one thing that we should really ask for is a kind of liar's kind of contract. If an MP says they're going to do this, that, and the other, and you elect them, and they don't do it, which is what they're doing all the time, you should be able to immediately go to court and say, you know, 50% of what they've said they're not doing, he can't be or she can't be an MP anymore. You know, so that there's something. We need to reform. We need to make sure that we're still allowed to protest. Yes. You know, this COVID stuff that is actually preventing people from protesting is really important. Whistleblowers need to be genuinely protected. We have to stop the secrecy that continues to stop us getting the information about what corporations are really doing and what governments are really doing. The Good Law project that's going on at the moment is absolutely excellent, because it's actually trying to do something about getting the light into these things.
And there are good news sources, groups available. I mean, on the media side, I think Double Down News, Byline Times, and on the secrecy side, I think this group Declassified UK that's been going only 15 months is remarkable for what it's finding out.
Yes.
And all power to those, because, and there's Open Democracy as well, which has much more of a worldwide thing, and there are equivalents elsewhere. So while we have all the problems of the mainstream media and its sort of focus, there are other ways through. But I would agree with you what you were saying earlier on about the power of the corporations and the huge power now that we have such incredible divisions of wealth and poverty. But
Yes.
Coming back to your own position, I mean, you've been working in this field now for something like 40 years, and you've been up against some of the biggest challenges of all. How do you cope yourself? Because I mean, partly working in peace studies and having a fair bit to do with campaigning groups, you do see people burn out. How do you keep cheerful and optimistic?
A lovely partner, a lovely family, support around there. You need a support network.
Yes.
Say this to a lot of young activists. You're not on your own. You have to have support around you. So that's really important. Gardening, growing things, thinking locally as well as, and just actually you get a lot of fun and enjoyment about meeting all these wonderful people from around the world, knowing that we're all struggling for a better world. It's good fun. It's not just difficult.
No. Well, there's more to discuss, but let's just take one or two questions. There's one here, a great one here from Jane Lewis. What was the action that gave you the most joy?
Oh, right. Well, stealing the police boat. That was really great.
Oh, yeah. Do tell us about that. It's brilliant.
Just
Yes.
before Trident Plowshares started, actually, there was a women's camp at the at Georgina's Wood, just near Coalport, and we decided one night. The police boats were out there and they didn't have any lights on because they were trying to stop us knowing where they were. And we crept along this rocky beach, cut through various wires to get into Coalport. The lights all came on. We found a police boat there, jumped into it and found the keys were in there. It took us quite a long time to work out how the hell to start the boat. And then we drove it into the high security area, right into where the missiles are loaded into the Trident submarines at Coalport. And we'd noticed that the police were just kind of putting their hand up, We didn't have our lights on. The police didn't have their lights on. So they just saw this sign. They just thought we were more policemen. We didn't find anything in Coalport, so we decided to go all the way around the loch to Faslane. And it was just such fun driving that fast police rib. And they didn't catch us until the lights at Faslane. And then there was a police chase. When we got to the boom area where the submarines were at Faslane, two women jumped in and tried to get to the submarines. And the police came up and said, "I hope you're not filming this." That was just such fun. It was fun.
That was priceless. And it was a great question as well. One slightly different, this is from Jane Lewis, is on behalf of Chris. How do you discern what is just a mad idea and what is a mad idea but worth taking forward?
You don't. You don't. Everybody says, "Oh, Angie, that's a mad idea," and you just sort of say, "Okay, well, if enough people come up," for instance, the Faslane 365, to make it easier, I said, "Okay, if we get the first month actually filled in by different groups, we'll go ahead. If we don't get that many, none of you have to do it." And that gave people the confidence to know if they joined in and put the effort into getting people up from their area, it was worth it. So, yeah, I mean, just come up with as many mad ideas as you can and then try them out. But make sure that they are non-violent and also that you can explain it to people so that you're not, you could go completely off the rails. So you do have to keep checking in that it's not genuinely mad.
Yes. And going obviously well prepared and particularly use the experience of other people. This is one of the joys of the book because you pack so much into it, and particularly towards the end when you're sort of giving a very sort of wise view of what works, what doesn't work, and what to beware of and what to celebrate, which I think is hugely important. Right, we've got a question here. This is from Anne Erdley. Oh, this is one. How can we influence the Labour Party to change their stance on Trident?
Oh, God, I despair of the Labour Party. It's no longer a socialist party. Sorry. I don't know what we do. I mean, our political system is broken, quite frankly. You know, I think everybody should vote Green, and I expect they'll have some problems as well. But, you know, we can't rely on the politicians to do this. We all have to try to create the change where we are locally and do what we can.
And this
the
is
Labour Party, I think I've given up, you know, even thinking that they can do very much.
I'm afraid an awful lot of people have. And I mean, whatever you think of the Corbyn era, those 5 years, some of the policies that were coming through then, the wider policies, were really pretty remarkable.
They were very good, yeah.
I mean, my wife, Claire, you know, she actually sort of goes back and looks at that 2017 manifesto quite often. And the extraordinary thing is how many of them are so obvious now. You know, things that were treated as completely way outside are now so obvious, which in a sense is a marker of what could happen and may well happen again.
I hope so, yes. We have to hope.
Yes, but more widely, I mean, we've got a little bit, but essentially, I mean, there's one question here from Sue. This is a good one. You might be not surprised at this. Angie, you're amazing, as always. What are you planning next?
Oh, I don't know. What are you all planning next? And I'll come and join in.
Yes. But no, seriously, I mean, where do you see the need now? I mean, I agree very much with you that it looks very pessimistic politically, but there's a huge amount happening, and it's extraordinary how people have come to help on the COVID side, you know, all the community work. Where if you were given the opportunity, what would you do now, do you think? Is that unfair?
Oh, yes. I don't know. I don't know. You know, I have ideas. I start things, you know, people join in, other people invite me to do things. But then there's these periods in between when I'm kind of lost and I'm not quite sure what is needed. And I just have to wait until something else emerges. And I suppose at the moment, I'm in that kind of space. But I'm not sure what we can do here. All I do know is that even though we have COVID times at the moment, we need to still get out into the streets. We've had over a year now. We're getting our vaccinations, and we can't allow business as usual, because just last week, a nuclear convoy went up to Scotland. You know, they're doing their work. This last week, I heard from the Sarawak, you know, in this Peace Park, the Upper Baram forest area, logging is continued, even though the law says now, and the Sarawak government and the ITTO said they won't be logging there. The loggers are in there. So, you know, whatever you look at the moment, business as usual, corporations as usual are going ahead. So we have to be stopping that in whatever way we can. So for me at the moment, I'm supporting other people, not involved in a big way, but just supporting in the background, fighting the intensive poultry units in the poultry capital of Europe, which is what Powys is at the moment, because of the damage that that's doing ecologically. And again, we're getting all the greenwash about how this is going to be giving everybody cheap food, and therefore we have to be supporting it. Many people don't realize that agriculture, the agri-businesses, are actually doing more for climate chaos. They're creating more climate chaos problems than cars and aeroplanes put together. So we do have to think about being more self-reliant as a country rather than getting all the resources from these other poorer countries. Africa's the richest continent for resources in the world. So why should it have the poorest people? That's because of corporations and governments supporting corporations.
I've got a question here from, it's actually from Lauren. Again, what would you hope to see? And I emphasize that, what do you hope to see from COP26 in Glasgow later in this year?
Oh, what I'd like to see or what I hope to see, I don't know. I'd like to see the governments and the people there actually saying, okay, no more fossil fuels. Okay, we will change the agricultural system. Okay, we will work as global citizens together so that equality around the whole world is that we will stop the gap between the rich and the poor. so that we become more united in all sorts of ways. So there's all sorts of things on all sorts of issues I would like to see. Whether that will happen or not will depend upon the amount of pressure that we put now to that time. It's no good just going to COP26 and going up to Glasgow and demonstrating then. We have to be putting on the pressure now. And of course that is beginning.
Yeah, yes. And I mean, what is extraordinary, personally, I think, is the way that Extinction Rebellion came into this. We've had this sort of, I mean, after all the problems of first leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump, and beyond that, Bush and successive Australian presidents and prime ministers rather, who've been really very pro fossil fuels, and of course all the other problems. That is changing, and I think, you know, you look at the way that scientists who've been working in this field are more prepared to say it as it is, rather than always try and get a sort of a complete consensus. And that was very important. And it's also clear that the climate is changing now. I mean, you're very active on the allotment. We have a small holding, and we've lived in the same place for 50 years. And you see the differences. You take a gardening diary from 40 years ago and compare it now, and it is so obviously different. So it's actually happening in front of our eyes. And the other positive thing, I mean, that is negative in a way because it's happening so quickly. But the other positive thing is there really has been a huge increase in public concern and awareness. And there are very good changes which actually can be done. I mean, we could have been far more near entirely renewable, self-sufficient in energy some years ago. We could certainly do it very quickly now. And there are many other opportunities where one could speed it up.
Yeah.
But you just have to work across these so many areas. Yeah, I mean, one looks daunted. I mean, I remember somebody saying, well, when you're working in this field for so long, you end up with three options. You're either alcoholic, suicidal, or optimistic.
Yes.
But the point is that you clearly are optimistic. But in fact, a question which comes, in fact, Bex Woodford asked, which relates to what you said a little bit earlier, and I'd like to explore it a bit. It's very simply, how have you avoided burnout? You told us a little bit, but I mean, you've been so incredibly active for so long. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Mainly by swapping issues every now and again, meeting new people. But I haven't avoided burnout, definitely. I haven't always recognized it early enough. My partners said, or, you know, people have told me that I have been. But I suppose the burnout that I got was mainly in Israel, Palestine, when I'd come back and give talks about it and cry and not be able to kind of deal with it very well. So I think it is very difficult to avoid burnout. And certainly now that I'm getting older, I find it more difficult to cope with lots of people and doing things very, very intensively. But the main way of avoiding burnout is just being aware and having creative things to do. You know, I did pottery and caned chairs, and I've grown my own food and vegetable. I've got a loving family, you know, a loving partner. All of that helps, you know, and exercise and things like that. But I think it is difficult when you're working on these complex subject issues, not seeing very much progress. I mean, all of the issues that I worked on, forest destruction, the forests are still being destroyed. Nuclear weapons, they're still there. Nuclear power, we still not solved the waste problem and it's still going ahead. You could look all at those things negatively and say, and then my son says that to me, well, why are you still protesting? You haven't succeeded. Luckily, I've got a daughter that says, just carry on. I've got other people that say, and he doesn't not support me. He just says, why are you doing it? You know, why don't you do something else? I don't know. We do.
So why did you write the book?
A lot of people are asking for the stories, and I just thought it would be nice to write them down. But also, it's important to try to pass on anything that you might have learned. And so thinking about it in terms of lessons, and things that I've learned, I thought it might be useful to people. So I just thought, yes, I'll do that. Yeah.
And now you've done it. How has your view changed of what you've been trying to do and what you see as necessary in the future? Has that changed at all in writing all this down?
probably not. I guess it's clarified a few things for me.
Yeah.
I suppose it's been going around in my mind for so long that I find that a difficult question to answer.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the chat people are saying, you know, it's this one from Penny. It's great that you've written some of the stories down. We all have so much to learn from your experience. So thank you. And I think many people would really be saying that. We just.
But I must say that if we listen to each other, everybody's got a story to tell, and we can learn from everybody. And actually, one of the things that I would really like to do more of is for people who've got very, very different ideas to talk to each other so we can listen to each other.
Yes, yeah. And I think one of the most interesting areas here is when you do get opportunities to talk to people who are coming at it from a very different angle. I've been very lucky to do a fair bit of sort of guest lecturing at defence colleges. And the extraordinary thing is that, you know, you will be talking to people who may take a radically different view, but people in the sort of middle ranks of the military will listen in a way that many politicians just won't. And I remember there's one occasion, this was back at the main Joint Service College, it'd be about 20 years ago, and they actually decided to have a kind of debate on whether Britain should have nuclear weapons or not. And they asked one of the leading, in fact, a Commodore from the Polaris side of things, well, it was Trident by then, side of things, to give the sort of the positive case. And they asked me to speak against it, but it wasn't a hard debate, it was a long discussion. But the extraordinary thing was, I think about 300 of the people there from abroad and about 100 were from Britain. And the commandant at the end actually asked the British members whether they thought that Britain should have nuclear weapons. Now, these are all people at major lieutenant colonel or equivalent rank, and about a third of them said no, which I found quite staggering. You know, I hadn't sort of realized that, you know, now, okay, you could say, well, the army never liked them because they would have got killed first in Germany, but it's more than that. There's much more questioning which can come to the surface if you push it. And I think, you know, this is one of the extraordinary things that you've done. We're almost coming to the end. I see we've got just a couple of minutes more. Maybe just I'll finish on two things. Very much personally to thank you for what you've done. I think you've been a remarkable inspiration right the way through. I'm delighted to see this book out. I mean, I've been reading it in draft and it's been a joy to read. I would recommend it to everybody. I mentioned at the start what Caroline Lucas had said, and I'll go through that again. What she said was, it's been one of the privileges of my life to be with Angie as she stands up for justice, peace and the environment. She personifies what being an activist means: courage, commitment, and a conscience. She's an inspiration to us all. At a much lower level, I also wrote a puff there, and I put it this way: with decades of experience of local, national, and international campaigning on many of the key issues of our time, Angie Zelter has distilled an extraordinary amount of determination and learning into an absolute gem of the book. It really is a gem of a book, and Angie, and I really thank you very much for putting pen to paper on this one. And as I said at the start, I hope very much that it will become a bestseller. It really does deserve to be. Now, I think, in fact, we're having to say that we're going to have to leave it at this point. Radha Danielle says, it's so inspiring, it was a pleasure to listen. And Anna says, thank you for your resilience, conviction, and commitment. Anna Meyer, thank you so much, Angie. Margaret Ferguson Burns, looking forward to reading the book. I gather the book will be, this interview, discussion, will be available in a recorded form, and Luath will be making that available for everybody. And I hope you will spread the word and tweet and Facebook and the rest, and spread the word about this, because it really deserves to be read by a huge number of people right around the world. So at that point, I think we have to say goodbye. Thank you again, Angie. It's been an absolute delight. And you know, I look forward to hearing from you and meeting up again. Possibly we might meet next time when we're not in court with you in the dock, me in a witness box. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.